Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So here's the brief overview of what we covered last week with regard to the history of fiqh and some points on usul al-fiqh. This more serves as a way to develop a background knowledge that will give you some insight as to how fiqh as a science and body of knowledge developed and the research tools and principles behind it, how it was that they were codified, because those tools and principles, the core of them were communicated in the generation of revelation. So the Prophet Muhammad SAW modeled for the companions, and there are instances in which the companions are modeling back to the Prophet SAW how to deal with the book in the Sunnah. Right? The famous hadith of Mu'adh bin Jabal being sent to Yemen as a judge and being asked, how will you judge by the Prophet ﷺ is indicative or illustrative of that. So it illustrates that the companions were not just accompanying the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and imitating, but also that there was a conscious effort on the part of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to ensure that they had an understanding of how to deal with the book in the Sunnah. And there are other realities that come along with this, such as the review of the Quran. Firstly, with Jibril, the Prophet ﷺ and Jibril reviewing the Quran, and then the companions, some of the companions that focus on the Quran, reviewing the Quran from beginning to end with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And this point here is probably one of the points that is least brought into the conversation on Aqida differences. But from herein, from this point, whether the Prophet Muhammad SAW communicated the understanding of the whole of the Quran or whether he just communicated what was essential is the main point of difference between the scholars of Ilm al-Kalam and the people of Athar in terms of Aqidah. Because some of the scholars say that the Prophet Muhammad SAW communicated only what was essential and left other parts to ijtihad, or ijtihad meaning to investigation and so on and so forth. Investigation and reflection, and for the believers to consider what the meanings are in light of the main principles of Islam, the Arabic language, so on and so forth. And so that opens up the door to the concept of ta'wil, which the concept of ta'wil in its original form has one meaning, and then later on it begins to develop a number of different meanings. And it is in this development where we find that differences among the ulama begin to emerge over its legitimacy. At first, ta'wil means to take a thing back to its origin, right? And so then the idea there is that there may be a word specifically or an ayah of the Quran, and there may necessitate clarification of its meaning. And you find that even in the time period of the companions, they asked the Prophet Muhammad SAW for clarification on certain things in the Quran, although they were people that understood the Arabic language quite masterfully. Right? That's one of the qualities of the companions, that they understood the Arabic language masterfully. The second quality was that they accompanied the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so they were taught the Sunnah and they saw the prophetic way. The third, which really is foundational, is that they witnessed the revelation of the Quran. Maybe not directly in every instant, but they were part of that generation in which the Quran was being revealed. So those three factors are essential when we think about the period of the Sahaba in terms of fiqh overall. And those three factors or those three qualities are what differentiate the time period of the companions from any other time period. Why? Because they were witnessing when an ayah of the Quran would be revealed and would be addressing a certain particular context. The other issue is that they understood the language, so there was no necessity to engage in an Arabic language program the way that others would have to engage. The contextual reality of the language, how the language is used, the practice of the language, the meanings, the correct pronunciation, all of that was a knowledge that they had, and they did not have to learn in the same way that others have to learn because they were people of that language. They lived it out. The other thing is that, as I pointed to, they saw when the Quran was being addressed to certain contexts, so they understood the nuances. The Quran was not something that was detached from life for them. It was very much embedded. Uh, its meanings were embedded in everyday life for them. The other issue is that there was no fabrication of hadith. So, although you can see that the beginnings of the sciences of hadith are there with the companions, when you study the interactions that they had with one another with regard to what it was that was being said about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or what it was that he said. Especially, you find sometimes that they question Abu Huraira, um, because Abu Huraira narrated so many hadith, and he was the youngest in time, so to speak, not necessarily in age, but he came later. But Abu Huraira is central in hadith narration because he narrated so many hadith, and that's why those who want to criticize hadith, they usually attempt to attack Abu Huraira because of these types of discussions that took place earlier on among the Sahaba themselves, wherein they put a filter on what it was that Abu Huraira was saying to ensure that it was correct. And so there's other instances as well in which the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, they are demonstrating that they're engaged in some sort of hadith methodology, all right, to verify what it is that is being said. But the idea of straight up fabrication of a hadith or fabricating something and attributing it to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whether word or deed, that didn't exist among the Sahaba. That really started to emerge, is claimed, when the Muslims went into Iraq. And at that time, Iraq was an environment where you had multiple religions. You had the Jewish religion, you had the Persian religion, which is the Zoroastrian, I should say, Zoroastrian religion. And the Iraqi area was considered to be a stronghold of civilization. So you had the mixing of different cultures and different ideas. So that posed a challenge to the Muslims that were coming out of an environment where pretty much you didn't have too many ideas. What you had were tribal differences, and you had a certain type of religious practice that was well known to the people. So going back, so the idea that the companions reviewed the Quran uh, in total, this becomes one of the main points of discussion in Aqida issues. Did they review it in total, or those that were selected in that case, let's put it that way, did they review it in total, like Ibn Abbas and Ibn Mas'ud, with understanding, or did they just review it in having an understanding of how to recite it in its basic meanings, right? And so the school that opens up the door more to ta'wil, which for the sake of just simplicity right now, we'll say interpretation of ayat of the Quran, they have a tendency of not focusing so much on that interaction of the companions with the text, so to speak, of the Quran. And so what happens later on when Ahl al-Bid'ah enter into the circle of the people of Islam and the Sunnah and so on and so forth. Because not all Ahl al-Bid'ah at one point are necessarily attaching themselves to the deen, right? There's other agendas. You begin to see the idea of interpretation expand. It expands out and it becomes exaggerated to the point where the Quran is given secret meanings, or the meanings of the Quran are exaggerated, or the meanings of the Quran are distorted, even to an extent where the Arabic language is violated. There's all kinds of twisted directions in which interpretation takes. And that's why at the end, Imam al-Ghazali and others, they realized how far that went. And so Imam al-Ghazali begins to write on the virtues or the benefits of the literal meaning of the text, because the interpretation movement went so far that the basic obvious meaning of the text was lost. And so that's what opens up the door for the question of whether there's metaphor in the Arabic language or not, which becomes the main point of debate for people like Ibn Taymiyyah and the Ashari school and others.
I got a quick question. I got a quick question, right? So
Sure.
you said that the companions were uh so many words. You said that the companions had had a stronghold in understanding of the Quran, right?
Mhm.
And okay, so where does this leave? I believe was it Uthman where he took 10 years to memorize Surah Baqarah, and he would come up off of it until he understood it all the way.
The Quran was being revealed gradually.
Okay, okay, I got you.
The Quran wasn't being revealed, or it was not revealed at that point in time all at one point. Because one of the nature of Quranic revelation, which distinguishes it from the Torah and the Injil, from what we have an understanding of, specifically the Torah, is that the Quran was revealed gradually to us. It was revealed all at one time to Lawh Mahfuz. And that's matters of the unseen. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
But to us as human beings, it was revealed gradually. So some of the companions, many of them didn't memorize the whole of the Quran, right? But the reality is that they were exposed. And then some of, like I mentioned, like Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, these had reviewed the whole of the Quran. That's why they became known to be like because the knowledge of the deen is also spread across the companions. Not all of them had the same type of knowledge. So some of them they had a general knowledge of Islam, and then they had specific types of knowledge, like knowledge of fiqh or knowledge of inheritance, like this, knowledge of when the Quran was the different uh contextual situations when the Quran was revealed and so on and so forth. And the companions, the leading ones especially, they had an understanding of the objectives of the deen, the principles of the deen, and they had the circle of knowledge with them. And they would ask one another with regard to that which they didn't know. So, one of the important points about the four imams later on, which in reality is the schools of fiqh, but people try to limit it to four, is that, or let's put it this way. One of the important things about people like Malik and then Shafi'i is that they codified the Sunnah. Writing is different than codification. Writing is an organizing affair. I mean, codification is an organizing affair. Writing is just putting something to paper or to whatever materials were being used at that time with the intent of preserving in some slight or level of organization. But codification is a higher level of organization, and you have a filtering process, and you have a clear intent on what it is that you want to achieve by means of systematizing the knowledge. So the first instance that we have that has come down to us as of that when it comes to hadith and fiqh is the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Now there were other books that were entitled Muwatta, the trodden path, so to speak, and is similar to the concept of Sunnah, or the term Muwatta in that regard. And you had other books that were entitled by that uh, name, but they didn't survive. They didn't survive. And so then the other instance of that is the work of Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmed, right? And it actually the Muwatta is it really is that path which is made easy, right? That path which is made easy. And he worked on it for quite a long time, right? And so then what Imam Shafi'i, he comes because he was a student of Malik, but he was a student of others as well. Imam Malik remained in Medina almost exclusively. And Medina was the city of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the unique features of Medina at one point in time are that what you see in Medina is equivalent to what is Sunnah because the people are embodying the practice of the deen, right? So it's a living reality. Then With time, that concept is questioned, in part because the companions went to different regions of the world in the map of that time for the Muslim community or the Muslim Ummah. And they took the knowledge of a hadith with them. They took the knowledge of Sunnah with them. So when Imam Shafi'i emerges, he and Imam Ahmed are engaged in a codification process. A Shafi'i does something that is unheard of in his time period from what we know or from what I know. And that is that he requests of Imam Ahmed to collect the ahadith based on strength of narration and not just on the idea of region, right? Because before ahadith were being collected based on the region, in addition to other principles that were used, like the people of Iraq and the people of the Hijaz or the people of Medina in that way. And there were reasons for that. Part of it was filtering out infiltration from those that may fabricate or those that were unknown, right? Those that may fabricate or those that were unknown in the deen or they were unknown in terms of knowledge. Because that's part of the criteria of transmitting hadith. What's your status in deen and what is your knowledge like?
Right. Gotcha.
Right. And then that goes into the idea of al-adala wal-dabt. Al-adalatu wal-dabt. Those two concepts come up in hadith sciences. When you look at narrator criticism, the adala has to do with your deen. It has to do with your character and literally how just are you. And then the issue of dabt has to do with the way that you transmit knowledge, memory and writing, or one to the exclusion of the other at times. But in any event, Shafi'i, he tells Ahmed, Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal, so Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i, he tells Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal to collect the hadith and do so in such a way that you're just looking at the soundness of the narration and you're not completely focused on eliminating hadith because the person is from a particular region to that effect. So by that time, their time period, because they're the out of the four imams, they're the later imams. So Imam Malik and Abu Hanifa or Abu Hanifa and Malik, they're the earlier imams. And if you notice, they established themselves before the codification of hadith and before the codification of usul al-fiqh and hadith sciences. Because the Risala of Imam Shafi'i, which is the book that he codified in usul al-fiqh. At that time, usul al-fiqh and hadith sciences were combined together very carefully. In that book, he codified the knowledge of how to deal with the language, how to deal with evidences, how to deal with conflict between evidences, what are the rules for engaging analogy, how do you deal with ahadith of certain types. In the backdrop, some scholars like Dr. Mahmoud Abdurrahman, he says that Shafi'i in his Risala was refuting indirectly the Mu'tazila because they had arisen at that time period. And so the difference between the two older schools and the two later schools, it very much is rooted in this codification process, especially when it comes to hadith. And that's why you find that there's differences between them because the older generation, Malik and Abu Hanifa, uh, they had a certain criteria that they operated from. So their students that come in the madhab later on, not their direct students, have to adjust to the fact that now the sunnah is codified beyond region. Malik and Abu Hanifa were heavily focused on regional knowledge. Like, they operated off of regional knowledge, and that was a way for them to filter and control from misunderstanding and so on and so forth. And it was a phase in Islamic knowledge overall. But the reality that the knowledge of the Sunnah has spread out that demanded a regathering of that knowledge. That's why Imam Ibn Taymiyyah says the knowledge of the Sunnah is not with one companion, right? But is with the companions as a whole because of these types of things. So eventually, with each phase, like if you look at the time period of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you have a complete model, but you don't have a clear explication for those that come after. Like, what is it? What is the principle that you use? Like, there's no naming of the principles that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is using. Uh, that begins to emerge in the time period of the companions after the transition of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so one of the clear examples you can find is when Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was the head of the Ummah, the Khalifa. He would keep the leading companions close to him just like Omar did. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, when he would judge, because there's judging is different than fatwa, right? Judging is different than fatwa. One of the main differences is that judgment is binding. It's like difference between legal advice and court issued ruling. One is binding, the other one is not. And so at that period of time, the companions, the leading companions, they were gathered. So Abu Bakr as-Siddiq would inquire. He would ask on a particular matter if anyone heard anything, if there was something from the Quran, if anyone heard something from the Sunnah with regard to the particular issue that they were dealing with within that gathering of consultation and leadership. And so if no one can come up with textual evidences to deal with the situation, then he would attempt to come up with a consensus. If they could come to a consensus on the issue, consensus meaning the ijma, meaning that nobody differs. All of them, they are in full agreement. Then, so that's where the idea of ijma begins to emerge. The idea of qiyas was already there, but it was talked about as a tamthil, that I would compare and find the likeness between two different situations. Then it became called qiyas. So you had that, and then you had majority position in the case that the companions didn't agree to the extent where it could be considered an ijma or consensus, then it would be majority position. And then after that, if Abu Bakr couldn't find, he would choose between the best opinions, or he would just, if he couldn't resolve the issue, just uh determine a path on his own. Malik in the Muwatta follows a similar system, meaning that his opinion is not the first opinion. His opinion always comes last. He puts forth book sunnah, the consensus practice of the people of Medina, before you start seeing his own opinion. So this was a technique that the scholars had earlier on. So for the companions, they had the book, the sunnah, they had ijma', they had qiyas, and then what began to come into play was that they had the rulings, which could be considered under qiyas as well, or the statements of the leading companions as far as judgment, and then their fatwas, or their legal opinions, or their opinions of guidance. That was the early foundation that was set as far as the sources of knowledge and the main principles of research. Right? That's how we get the main foundations of fiqh.
Okay.
And then the companions are followed by their students, which eventually become the four madhabs. You know, but the four madhab concept is a late concept, it's not a new concept. It's not an early concept, I should say. That's what I mean by new. It's a very late concept because there were so many madhab. Madhab is the plural of madhab. It's almost a myth to think that the four madhabs, that was it. That's not true at all. And that's a misunderstanding because what ends up happening sometimes is that you have multiple madhabs come into a school as well. So this is the foundation that was set for fiqh. And what happens within the late day is that they become more and more focused on the statements of their imams. They become more and more focused on their internal research, and the students become more and more distant from understanding the statements of the companions and their judgments and their positions and their consensus and so on and so forth. And this is some of the things that, is not understood by people in a lot of these debates on these issues because they're not understanding the history. They're not understanding the way that fiqh developed and unfolded. They're not understanding the purposes of fiqh, right? Even when it comes to Quran and Sunnah. So the idea of transmitted proofs right here and rational proofs, That's not understood. الدليل نقلي and عقلي. And the same in Aqida issues. Because in Aqida issues, a lot of the stuff, even though what ends up happening is that each discipline kind of takes on a life of its own. In reality, when we talk about usul al-fiqh or the principles of understanding earlier on, there was the Aqida a lot because, like we said, Imam Shafi'i was refuting the Mu'tazila with the Risala. But Aqida, as we mentioned, part of it has to do with language, linguistic analysis. That's why you say the text stresses that understanding evidence is not merely quoting a verse, an ayah of the Quran or Hadith. It requires linguistic analysis. This comes from our class. How do you understand the ayah of the Quran Hadith? It's not just a matter of quoting.
I can understand what you mean within linguistic analysis because you may read something in the Quran and it be totally different of what your understanding might be. Some things I understand are meant to be understood as is, and some things need explanation. I understand that part real clearly there.
Yeah, so the reality of the situation is that um the reality of the situation is that when it comes to Aqidah issues, right? When it comes to Aqidah issues, the issues come back to language as well. And as we mentioned, there's a position that states that the companions were taught Aqidah. You know what I'm saying? They were taught Aqidah. So they were taught the they were taught the meanings.
It taught the meanings of the Quran in terms of the ayat, of the isma, the sifat. Right? So that's where a lot of the differences come in, and then the issue of the overusage of the dalil aql. If you have a textual evidence,
Oh, Sheikh, you sound far away, man. You sound like you robotic a little bit here and there. It sound like your bike dropped or something.
If you have
There you
if
go.
you have textual evidences, right? If you have textual evidences, is there a need to use rational evidence? That becomes the question. You know what I'm saying?
Where it be if you do have textual evidence, but if you don't understand it, doesn't rational thought come in?
Right, but the debate over how much do you use rational thought, and we're not just talking about any kind of rational thought. We're talking about the tools of reasoning that are known in Sharia sciences. And so that's the main split that comes up historically is between Ahl al-Hadith and Ahl al-Rai. And that's what's called the Ahl al-Hadith, Ahl al-Rai division. Shafi'i comes in and kind of brings those two tendencies together because that split or that tension began earlier on. You know what I'm saying? It began earlier on before Shafi'i. It began at the time of Malik and Abu Hanifa, which you're talking about the time of the Tabi'in, right? So it began very early. And so Shafi'i starts ushering in the importance of understanding the literal meaning of the Quran, the importance of Sunnah, because the Mu'tazila started to dictate and impose a certain way to the extent that Imam Ahmed is in prison, right? And these are the things that later on in Aqida, this stuff comes right back up because in the earlier generation, there's hostility towards the Mu'tazila. But the later day scholars, especially in the Ash'ari school, they harmonize more and more with them. So that's kind of where you begin to see, a lot of the fitna, if that makes sense. So what you have is a major discussion on what is the role of reason in the deen, in Aqida and Fiqh overall. That becomes a major discussion, and it remains so to be a discussion till today. But it was never a point where it was so out of whack that there was no role for reasoning. There was, so that's important to comprehend.
You go to end here? Okay.
So let's end the recording here because I have to get ready to jump into another class, inshallah. And we'll regroup next week, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum.